Hi everybody, this is Angie from Tourangie.com, and today we're going to talk about the Battle of Pigeon's Roost. And the reason we're going to talk about it is I'm going to read an article out of this Mercer County history book, and the first part of this article starts talking about Oakwood Cemetery, and we just left Oakwood Cemetery. That was the past video, so we're not far away from the Battle of Pigeon's Roost. Actually, the historical marker for it, is near Dairy Queen on Walker Street? North Walker Street? Anyway, so let me read this to you. And of course, this book was written in the 1980s, so the date that they're talking about, but I'm going to read it word for word. 111 years ago, on the 16th and 17th of May, 1862, just a few hundred yards from the south of the spot that the Confederate cemetery, which is now part of the Oakwood Cemetery, is where the standing occurred, the Battle of Pigeon's Roost. Pigeon's Roost acquired its name from the vast flocks of passenger pigeons which roosted in the large timbers that flourished in and around the area of the site of the City Hall. In Memoirs of Old Princeton, you will find an account about a man from Rich Creek near Spanishburg who observed a flock of pigeons about 1 mile wide, so dense it blocked out the sun. Even though the flock traveled with the speed of an arrow, it was so large, thousands, millions of pigeons, that it took 45 minutes for the flock to pass any given point. These passenger pigeons roosted in the heavy timbers just south of Princeton, and it was not uncommon for the limbs to come crashing down to the ground due to the weight of these birds. At night, the town people with pine torches and gunny sacks visited the roost to gather the birds by sacks full, perhaps the pigeon's soup or stew. The passenger pigeons, which were so plentiful in 1862, were in a few years extinct. Alone, about 1910, only one passenger pigeon was known to be alive, and it was kept at a zoo in Cincinnati, and a bounty of $1,000 was offered to anyone who could find it a mate. The roosting areas of these pigeons was the site of which the battle of the war between the states in 1862. Colonel Walter Jennifer, commanding a detachment of the Confederate cavalry forces in Princeton, filled the courthouse with several Confederate buildings and provisions for the Confederate troops. Princeton was an important objective for both armies. The Confederates had a heliograph on top of the Temple Knob, later the site of the Hell Home. This mirror system of communication was used to send messages from mountain to mountain until they reached the telegraph office in Dublin, Virginia. It took about 2 hours to get a message from Princeton to Richmond. In late April of 1862, General Jacob D. Cox, commanding Ohio troops, headed towards Princeton from the base at the Kanawha Valley by the way of Beckley. On May 1st, when Colonel Jennifer heard the Federal troops were coming, he gave orders to set fire to the town. Thus, when Federal forces arrived, there would only be ashes. Judge Alexander M. Mahood was such an ardent Southern patriot that he set fire to his own home. His dog, which was tied in the house, perished in the fire, for by the time they noted the flight of the dog, the fire was so hot the rescue was impossible. The courthouse records were saved by a young man named George Hall. The Confederate troops retreated to Rocky Gap and then Wytheville, Virginia. When the Federal troops arrived in Princeton, they found a mass of smoke and flame. Only 4 or 5 buildings were left standing. The McNutt home, which still stands at the corner of Honaker Avenue and North Walker Street, was on fire when Federal troops arrived. They put out the fire, and two men who later were to gain national fame made the McNutt House their headquarters. These two were Sergeant William McKinley and Colonel Rutherford B. Hayes, both of whom became presidents of the United States. Through their efforts of an English woman visiting the halls, Aspinwall, the home of David Hall, was saved. Federal forces did not pursue the retreating Confederates but went on to Pearisburg, where in battle on May 10th, Colonel Hayes was slightly wounded. Upon learning through couriers that Confederate generals Gabriel Wharton and Humphrey Marshall were heading north towards Princeton, General Cox decided on May 5th to send Colonel Lewis von Blessing with 11 companies up Price Road to guard against an attack by Wharton troops. Meanwhile, General Cox and the remaining troops moved towards Princeton. The morning of May 16, 1862, dawned bright and fair. The farmers who were incapacitated for the military service with their wives and children were planting crops. The war seemed far away. On that morning, however, General Gabriel Wharton commanded the 51st Virginia Regiment, and Colonel A.J. Mays, commanding the 5th Kentucky Infantry, marched towards Princeton to join General Humphrey Marshall, who they thought was in command of the Confederate forces there. That night they camped at Perry Gibson's farm at the south base of East River Mountain. General Marshall and his Kentuckians were camped at Rock, not Princeton. Instead of proceeding to Princeton by way of 5 Mile Fork, Colonel von Blessing moved up East River to Hardy and Ingleside to within 4 miles of General Wharton. Cox and his men occupied Princeton early on the morning of May 17th. Later, General Marshall moved in on Princeton. These two forces seesawed back and forth during the morning. General Wharton, on the morning of May 17th, broke camp with the Byrds. With only one wagon filled with medical supplies and a barrel of whiskey, the Confederate troops crossed the East River Mountain, moving quickly through the gap of Stony Ridge northward to Princeton. They approached Princeton from the south, using what was known then as the Wythe, Grayson, and Raleigh Turnpike. When General Wharton reached Pigeon's Roost, 1 mile south of Princeton, he was in full view of the town. To his dismay, he found that Princeton was occupied by Federal troops instead of Confederate forces under General Marshall, as he had been led to believe. He had noted the nearness of Colonel von Blessing's troops following up on him from the crossroads. To the left of Pigeon's Roost, going towards Princeton, was a meadow of grass, which was tall at that time of year. General Wharton dispatched Major Peter J. Odie to form a line which would guard against the attack from General Cox to defer Princeton from the approach of Colonel von Blessing. General Wharton, with a guide, then went to seek out General Marshall, who was fighting just west of Princeton on the New Hope Road. Major Odie took him 3 companies of infantry, 1 piece of artillery under Lieutenant Langhorne, and the wagon of medical supplies. He deployed his men in the line about 10 feet from the fence and made his men lie down in the tall grass. Colonel von Blessing's troops captured the wagon containing the whiskey, and his troops, mostly conscribed Germans who could be scarcely understood, soon became, in the words of H.W. Straley, gloriously hilarious and reckless. Being unaware of Major Odie's infantry in the tall grass, they walked into a death trap. The battle between 3 Confederate companies of men and 11 Federal companies began at 10 o'clock and was quickly over. Colonel Blessing's men fled down the hill to the area of the present Princeton Athletic Field. The declared federal troops hurried across Brush Creek at the old Carball House, detoured through the farms of Fraser Bratton, Jacob L. Hypes, and H.W. Straley to the Ingleside Road, then went down 12 Mile Fork on East River, and after a short rest retraced their steps back through the farms of William Reynolds and Charles Stinson to a point near Pisgah Church. They then moved on to Spanishburg and from there back to Ohio. General Cox was forced to retreat from Princeton from pressure of Marshall and Wharton's troops, and from the nearness of General Henry Heath's forces coming up from Pearisburg. Cox began to retreat on the evening of May 17th and managed to get away just before Marshall occupied the town on the 18th. This ends part 1. I will do part 2 on another video as I'm leaving Princeton. It'll be out in a couple days. This is Angie from Tourangie.com. I hope you enjoyed my videos. Talk to you later.